Hey everybody, this is Mr. Monahan. This is the lesson for 9.6a on the quadratic formula. Our objective today is to solve quadratic equations using something called the quadratic formula. So we've had a couple of different things that we've used to solve these quadratics, and now we just have to come up with our next way that we use whenever the methods we've learned so far don't work, which is what we'll talk about. So before we get into that, we have a reviewing problem. We have a graphing, ax squared plus c, so this has no b term. Remember, when we didn't have a b term, things were a little bit faster. A would be 2 for this one, c would be -7, b would be 0. There is no b. Okay, when there's no b term, you could do the axis of symmetry with the -b over 2a, but that gives you 0. What we said is when you're graphing ax squared plus c, the vertex is just at 0c, which is at 0, -7. Excuse me. So in the middle of the table, we'll put our 0, -7. This is our x, y, t chart. So our vertex is at 0, -7. Right here. And then we kind of just plotted the points around it. We know that 1 and -1, 2 and -2 will have, respectively, the same values when you plug it in. So at 1, we're plugging in 2 times 1 squared minus 7. That's 2 minus 7, which is -5. So this would also be -5 at -1. So I'm here and here. Okay. At 2, we're plugging in 2 times 2 squared minus 7. That's 4 times 2, which is 8. 8 minus 7 is +1. So at 2 and -2, we are at +1. Okay? The domain is talking about which values of x are okay. It's always all real numbers when you're talking about parabolas. There is no x that you are not allowed to put into that equation. Range is always talking about y. When we have something that's opening up, that means we have a minimum value. So all the y's are greater than or equal to some number, and that number is the y coordinate of the vertex, which was -7. So all the y's on that graph will be bigger than or equal to -7. And then what we said was the solutions of this graph were here and here, the x-intercepts. That was one of the ways we solved these. We also used square roots to solve these, and we used factoring. Those were all different strategies. And let's go over the ones that we've done so far, the ones that we like, the ones that we don't like, so on and so forth. The first one that we talked about was graphing. Okay, graphing was a way to solve the parabolas, to solve the quadratic. We looked for the x-intercepts on the graph. Then I showed you how to use square roots. Okay, and then most recently we've looked at factoring. Those are our 3 types of solving that we have gone over and discussed. Well, let's talk about this next question here. What are the weaknesses of these methods? Well, for graphing, the main weakness is it's too much time. It takes too long, or too many steps. This is just something that we all kind of agreed on. Graphing is not the best or most efficient way to solve parabolas. With technology, like graphing calculators and things like that, maybe graphing isn't so bad because it's more just punching something in, but that's not our favorite way to solve. Square roots were great, except for they didn't work. It doesn't work if there is a b term. Okay, so you can't solve x squared plus 5x plus 10 equal to 0. You can't solve that by square roots because there is a b term. Okay, as soon as there's a b term, something with an x to the 1, you can't do square roots. Okay, factoring, the weakness of that is not every quadratic is factorable. We haven't seen it much on the homework yet, but back in chapter 8 we had some times where we just said, hey, this answer is prime. There is no way to factor this. So here's something maybe x squared plus 5x plus 7. There are no multiples of 7 that add to 5, so this is not factorable. Well, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a solution. It might, or it may or may not. It kind of depends on our last method. So all of them have their ups, all of them have their downs. Square roots was the fastest one, but you can't do it all the time. Factoring is almost always the best way because it's faster than the next thing that I'll show you. But the nice thing about this next one, quadratic formula, is it always works. There is not a single time where you could not use this method to solve. The problem with it, the downside to it is probably, if you look at it, look how long that formula is. Look how messy that formula is. There's going to be times where this is the only way to solve, and that's kind of what we're going to start looking at here. So this one says, the quadratic formula is a new method to be able to solve these quadratics, and it's one that's always going to work. Remember, when you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, this equation that I put in the red box is called the quadratic formula. Here's what it says. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There's a way to remember that with the song, and it's Pop Goes the Weasel. I'm not going to sing on camera, but that's something that in person we would normally look at together. Steps to solving with the quadratic formula. Just take a look at these. You want to make sure you know what A, B, and C are, and you got to make sure that you have something equal to 0 first, just like factoring. Then we're going to plug in those values and try to simplify. Just like before, you can have 0 answers, you can have 1 answer, or 2 answers, okay, depending on what type of parabola you have. So there's times where, remember, we're looking at x-intercepts. There are times where our parabola just never touches the x-axis. So this would be no real solutions, okay? And what that would look like in the quadratic formula is maybe we have like x is equal to, let's just make something up, so negative 6 plus or minus the square root. Maybe we get like a negative 42 in here, all over 2 times 2, okay, 2a. Just like before, you can't have a negative in your square root. So this would be a situation that it doesn't, the parabola doesn't have any real solutions. We can have one solution, okay, and that's just something like this. Okay, it's only touching the x-axis in one spot. This is one solution. And this would be something like, well, whatever you have, negative b plus or minus. This is when you get the square root of 0 all over 2a. Okay, so negative b plus or minus 0 over 2a. So if you get the square root of 0, that's just 0, and you end up with, I'll show you an example like that in a second, but that you end up with only one solution. And then 2 solutions is something we see a lot, okay? This would have 2 solutions because it crosses the x-axis in 2 spots. It would be negative b, x is equal to negative b, plus or minus. This is when you get a square root of something positive. It might be a perfect square like 16. It might be not. It could be like square root of 20 or something like that, 2a. But those are the situations that you can end up with quadratic formula. And that's not anything too new. All right, let's go through a couple of these. Examples of solving with the quadratic formula. Make sure that you have one side equal to 0 before you start. All of these end up having that. What I would do before trying to solve anything is write down what A, B, and C are. So A is 1, B is -4, and C is +4. All three of those letters end up in our formula, A, B, and C. All right, so let's try to set this up. All right, the formula goes like this. Let me just write it at the top here so we have it. X is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over, oops, I didn't want to do quite like that. Sorry, one sec. There we go. B squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay. All right, let's plug things in for this left-hand one into this formula. We have x is equal to -b, negative, but b is -4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is -4 squared. Notice how I'm using parentheses every time I replace something. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is +4. All of this, including the -b part out front, is over 2 times a, which is 1. Okay? That looks really messy, and it gets a lot nicer this time, but this is a lesson that you just need your calculator sometimes. You need to show your work. You just got to try to fight your way through it. -4 out front, I'm just going to write as +4. Then we have plus or minus the square root. -4 squared is -4 times -4, which is +16, minus 4 times 1 times 4 is also 16. All of this is over 2 times 1, which is just 2. Okay, so with this one, what ends up happening is we end up with 4 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2. Well, the square root of 0 is 0, so 4 plus or minus 0 over 2. In a normal problem, we'd split up this plus or minus here, and we'd say, okay, one answer is when we have 4 plus 0 divided by 2. One answer is when we have 4 minus 0 divided by 2. But in this situation, those are both going to be the same thing. So there's only one answer here. This is just 4 over 2. So x is equal to 4 over 2, which is just 2. So there's one solution to that equation at the top. If I plug in 2, I get out 0. And you could plug it in and check. We have 2 squared, which is 4, minus 8 is -4, plus 4 is 0. So you can plug those back in. Okay. Some of these you might try to be able to find a way to factor it as well, but that's not what we're practicing right now. So that's why I would always try to factor first if possible. But for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to do all of these with quadratic formula, even if there was a way to factor. Okay. All right, so we have A is 1, B is 2, C is 5. For this one, let's plug into our equation. X is equal to -b, so that would be negative, B is 2, plus or minus the square root of B squared, which is 2 squared, minus 4 times A is 1 and C is 5. All of this is over 2 times A, which is 1. Let's start to simplify. We have -2 out front, plus or minus the square root. 2 squared is 4. Okay. We have 4 minus 4 times 1 times 5 is 20. All of this is over 2 times 1, which is 2. And then this one, we have x equal to -2 plus or minus the square root of -16. And that should be a red flag right away, over 2. This right here is negative. And we can't do this. Okay? This has no real solutions. So if you get a negative square root, you kind of are at a point where you get to stop. You're all done. Because we know that that cannot be done with real numbers. This one has no real solutions. Okay. All right, let's get into some of these ones where I think you'll see a little bit more what it's going to be like each time. So the blue and the green are both kind of the unique situations where if you get a square root of 0, you only have one answer. If you get a negative square root, you have no answers. So these ones, I believe, both will have 2 answers, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay, let me identify, we have A is -2, we have B is +6, we have C is -1. Okay, X will be equal to -B, -6. Always use those parentheses when you plug in. Plus or minus the square root of B squared, which is 6 squared, minus 4 times A is -2 times C is -1. All of this is over 2 times A, which is -2. Next step, X is equal to -6 plus or minus the square root. 6 squared is 36. We have -4 times -2 times -1. Right here, this is 3 negatives in a row. A negative times a negative times a negative will be negative. Okay, so we have that part. Then 4 times 2 times 1 is 8 times 1, which is 8. Okay, all of this is over 2 times -2, which is -4. Okay, next step, X is equal to -6 plus or minus the square root of 28, which is not a perfect square, over -4. Okay, well, then at that point, we can just plug in square root of 28 into our calculator and get a decimal for that because we don't have a whole number that's going to be. So that's, if I plug that in, I get 5.29. I'm just going to call it 5.3. All of that is over -4. And now here's where you got to look at the plus or minus. This one will have 2 answers, and it's our first example like that. So X is equal to, we could have -6 plus 5.3 over -4, or we could have X is equal to -6 minus 5.3 over -4. So what I've just done is I've taken this plus or minus and I've split it up into 2 possibilities. And this is what you're going to have to do most of the time. Okay? So let's continue solving this. The rest of this is calculator work. -6 plus 5.3 is -0.7. So I have -0.7 over -4. Or X is equal to -11.3 over -4. And we'll just go to the calculator for that. The negatives are going to cancel out in both of these situations. And we'll end up with our final answers here. So we'll have 2 positive numbers. So let me just get my calculator out here. We have 0.7 divided by 4, which is one answer is 0.175. Notice that it's positive 0.175. And then I have 11.3 over 4, which is X equals 2.825. And decimals are more than okay with the quadratic formula. It's a very messy formula, so you can expect messy answers. All right, let's try one more. Okay, we'll try 3x squared plus 2x minus 4. So A is 3, B is 2, C is -4. X is equal to -b, -2, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 2 squared, minus 4 times A times C. All of that is over 2 times A, which is 3. Then, next step, -2 is just -2, plus or minus the square root. 2 squared is 4. I have 2 minus signs this time. I have a -4 times a -4. So I'm going to have a plus this time. That hasn't happened yet. But this is actually going to be a plus inside because I have 2 negatives. A negative times a negative is positive, and a positive times another positive is positive. So I have 4 times 4 times 3. So 16 times 3. So I have 48 right here. Okay. All of that is over 2 times 3, which is 6. Next step, X is equal to -2 plus or minus the square root of 52 over 6. 4 plus 48. Now, we'll just get a decimal for that, 52. When you do that, it should be just a little bit bigger than 7. So 7.2 is just rounded to the nearest tenth. That's divided by 6. Now I'm at the point where I'm going to split up my plus or minus. My answer is either -2 plus 7.2 over 6, or it's x equals -2 minus 7.2 over 6, splitting those two up. So then I'm in a situation where I have -2 plus 7.2, which is 5.2 over 6, or x is equal to -9.2 over 6. Go to the calculator, get your two answers. 5.2 over 6 is 0.86 repeating, so I'll go 867, or 9.2 over 6, which is 1.53 repeating, so I'll go 1.533. Okay. All right, so that's quadratic formula. It takes some practice. It's a little ugly, but make sure that you have that formula down. -b plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.